My name is Danny Hill Hansen and I work at Effect. We're going to do this in English so I can try and present a book to you in 15 minutes, which is a big project. We're also going to look at this from a more global perspective and a social perspective, so we're zooming out quite a lot when we talk about the Donut for Urban Development. How many of you are familiar with donut economics at all? Okay. We're about 50-50. Good. It's just to have an understanding about knowledge in the room. Donut economics is a critique of our global economic system written by Kate Raworth about 10 years ago. Since she created this book, the donut has been translated into a lot of spaces. We wanted to make a donut for urban development, and we partnered with both the Donut Economic Action Lab, which is Kate's team in the UK, and Stockholm Resilience Center, along with a lot of Danish partners you probably recognize. The book was created in a massive collaborative effort. There's 20 co-authors, 2 editors, and over 20 contributing experts that participated in the creation of the book. And it was developed over a year-long period, mainly in the format of doing big workshops over 2 to 3 days, kind of around Europe where we were located, to sort of push what this project could be and figure out how to scope something as big as global economics down to something useful for building industry practitioners. For those of you who are new to the donut, briefly, we have the inner part of the donut is the social foundation. Here we have mainly the sustainable development goals that deal with social well-being. And on the outside, we have the planetary boundaries that are developed by Stockholm Resilience Center. And the idea is that we should be able to achieve global social well-being within the limits of the planet. If we succeed in doing that, we will reach a safe and just space for humanity, which is ultimately the goal. So we wanted to find out, how do we actually define this space for the building industry? Notably, as you may know, we are overshooting 6 out of 9 of our planetary boundaries, and we are falling short on social foundation globally. The donut has been used before in many settings. So there's a Copenhagen donut, for example. There's donuts for different neighborhoods and different regions. The difference between our donut and these donuts is that ours is sector specific. So it was the first time the Donut Economic Action Lab dared to go from their global concept down to a specific sector, which is why they agreed to collaborate on this project, because it was also sort of a big experiment for them. The donut for urban development is quite similar to the original donut, with the social foundation on the inside and the planetary boundaries on the outside. So our main contribution and important point for the donut for urban development is that we've defined an extra layer on the outside with climate stability at the top and healthy ecosystems on the bottom. I'll explain that in a moment. To understand the core principles of the donut, we can focus on 2 design principles. One is that we need to go from divisive economics, global economic systems where wealth and power is concentrated to the hands of the few at the expense of the many, to an economic system that is distributive, so that everyone who creates wealth and power benefits from the creation of it. That is the kind of core principle when we think about the social foundation. How do we take care of people in faraway places? On the other hand, in the ecological ceiling, we think about going from degenerative design to regenerative design. And I think that's more our home field in the building industry, where we've been thinking about how to do this for a long time. The main difference between the donut and a lot of the other sustainability schemes or certifications or ideas or principles that we have is that we are actually asking developers to go away from thinking about their responsibility as a local thing, looking at your building site or the specific project. How does that project impact Danish lives, for example, to consider the full global reach and impact of that project, so that we have an ecological ceiling that, on a global level respects the health of the whole planet, and on a social foundation, we actually think about the well-being of all people along the global supply chain. So this is a really big ask. When we were developing the book, we actually had the least amount of information on the global social foundation. We're getting quite good at measuring our impact with LCA, let's say, on the global level. These two core principles are actually quite simple. Typically, we think about our responsibility as developing on-site life for people that is thriving, but we need to extend that same dignity along the global supply chain. This is something that is new for us today, but it's actually coming to be a requirement on a European level with EU taxonomy and CSDR. So it's something we're going to have to start looking at. It'll maybe be a few years before it hits our industry hard, but we actually need to start knowing where our money goes and who it helps or who it hinders. On the other hand, when we think about the ecological ceiling, we're typically thinking about things like biodiversity on site. Do we leave a site better than we found it? And that's nice, and it's good for the quality of people's lives to have nature on site and consider those things, but 65 to 80% of our impact on biodiversity happens off-site along the material value chain. So it's essential that we actually take care of the off-site impact when it comes to biodiversity in the same way that we do for carbon assessment. I'll go through the book by chapter, just highlighting the key points from each chapter. I think typically when we see the Sustainable Development Goals, which are on the right side here, we see them as individual things on people's websites. Like you can kind of pick and choose what your company is really nice and focused on. And in reality, that's not how we can achieve them. We actually have to prioritize ecological well-being and planetary health on the bottom, and then social well-being is embedded in planetary health. There is no good life on a dead planet. And we need to start thinking of our businesses and economics in general as a way to achieve that ends rather than the goal in itself. Within the book, we've created two wheels. One is the social foundation and the other is the ecological ceiling. Each has 48 impact areas, 24 of which are local and 24 which are global. And these are things you can actually begin to start measuring in your building projects. Particularly when it comes to the global social foundation, we need data here. We don't really know what happens with our contractors, subcontractors, subcontractors. We don't have a good grip on who's impacted by the way we create our buildings. Within the book, we define each of these impact areas and we give example indicators so you can begin to think about how you can actually measure these things. And we provide cases that are, you could say, scratching the surface of the potential when it comes to social impact. Locally, it's quite easy to think about how we can improve development and real estate. So thinking about things like affordable rent, no paywalls, residents on boards, money-back schemes for residents. That's all stuff we can do locally. Where things get a little more complex and harder to maintain on a global level, but it's pretty straightforward. If something is illegal here in Denmark and we wouldn't accept it here, we should engage with businesses who do it somewhere else, let's say forced or child labor. When it comes to the ecological ceiling, the knowledge is a bit more complex. Again, the outside of the donut is the planetary boundaries. What we know about the planetary boundaries is that they're easy to kind of see and understand, but it's not really how life works. Social systems and natural systems are open and impacting each other. So while we can measure the different planetary boundaries, we need to actually consider that what we do here impacts someone far away and also impacts nature far away. And that if we're not respecting the health of the whole planet, then we're actually not really respecting the health here either. We spent 3 days at Stockholm Resilience Center talking to the guys who are creating the new planetary boundaries framework, and we wanted to find out from them what other planetary boundaries do we need to measure in the building industry? What's most important for us to measure? Should we be going through all 9 and set boundaries for all of those, or should we be looking at it on a big picture? Do we capture enough with carbon, for example, or what should we be focusing on? And they explained to us that the planet works basically in 2 ways. We have climate stability, which relates directly to climate change and ocean acidification. And we have healthy ecosystems, which relate directly to biodiversity, land use, and ocean health. And if we actually set measurable absolute targets for healthy ecosystems, which is really targets with biodiversity and climate stability, so again, carbon budgets, we can steer our building projects within planetary limits. So if we set the right targets, we can actually get to a place where we are creating buildings that are not creating a loss for the planet. The foundation, the ecological ceiling for the Donor for Urban Development has 2 halves. You could say the top is climate stability. This deals mainly with strategies for carbon reduction. And on the bottom, we have healthy ecosystems. And these impact areas deal mainly with things like nature. How do we actually improve our site and think about nature and maintaining natural systems on site and along the global supply chain? That chapter of the book is unfolded in the same way. I think we know a lot of the solutions here in this room, so I'm not going to go too much into those, but we have a 4th chapter of the book which looks at how we can actually set absolute targets for carbon and for biodiversity. It's very dorky, and there's about a 100-page document that is sort of the scientific ground for what is presented quite briefly in the book, so you can nerd out if you're interested. I think the overall story when we look at carbon budgets is that what we have done, for example, with the reduction roadmap is as generous as we possibly can be. If we want to align carbon budgets with just allocation principles and based on fair sharing of carbon budget, we actually end up in Denmark with negative shares of carbon. So it really poses the question about whether or not we should even be building new anymore. And if we do, what are we doing otherwise to repair the planet in other places? Likewise, we set targets for biodiversity and present 2 ways for measuring biodiversity, both on-site and off-site, using life cycle assessment tools that we already have. And essentially, we want buildings that have 0 species lost. We are so far away from that. And when you compare the data for biodiversity and carbon, you have some kind of conflicting decisions to make, because the low carbon materials everyone wants to use, like timber, are of course really bad for biodiversity. So it's important that we have both of these metrics on the table when we're taking material decisions, so we can actually make more informed decisions that respect the holistic planetary health. The final chapter of the book looks at business design, because if you're a developer and you don't actually design your business plan to achieve these things, it's not going to happen on a project-by-project basis. So you actually need to think about what is the purpose of what we're doing in the building industry. If it's to create meaningful societies and healthy places for people to live, we actually have to restructure and unlock the true purpose of our businesses, which is quite difficult in an industry that is dominated by short-term profit margins and pretty traditional economic principles. Overall, what we really need to focus on doing is setting absolute carbon and biodiversity targets for both on-site and off-site, and we need to begin transparent social impact assessment. We really don't know a lot on the social side of things, so it's important to get started. If we don't measure things, we can't take actions on them. So, while we have specific targets for carbon and biodiversity, we can't have the same for social. It's quite dynamic and on a case-by-case basis, but it's important to document the impact nonetheless. The book is open sourced and everything is available online. We have a lot of extra resources behind the book that were developed alongside the material. So as I mentioned, there's an appendix that kind of goes deep into the nerdy bits. There is a database which unpacks the impact areas and gives you an idea about which frameworks are already working with these impact areas. So if you're doing DGNB certification, you can quickly see which categories for DGNB are sort of covering some of the things we have put forth from the donut. So there's expanded content there. There is a prototype for a LCA for biodiversity, so you can actually download this and begin using it if you have access to EcoInvent or a like database. And we have a toolkit which dives deep into the book. So if you are the one sustainability person at your organization or you want to bring the donut to a project team, you actually have a lot of material that explains how to get started, how to understand the core material, and also how to set the right targets in your project and which frameworks need to have those targets embedded, like contracts and that kind of thing. So there is a lot of work behind the book that allows you to actually dive deep into it. It will take a lot more than 15 minutes to unpack the donut for urban development, but that is just the quick version. Thank you.